The doldrums is a nautical term, and it was used to describe an area of the ocean around the equator where ships often get stuck because it's calm, it's windless, they can't move. They're stuck, quite literally. But in present day English, the doldrums is a period of inactivity, of stagnation, but it's usually an indication that burnout is coming. So when people say, boy, I feel stuck, boy, I'm down in the doldrums, that's your first cue, you yourself, to say, hey, burnout's around the corner. I need to do something to reverse. I need to do something that can move me out of this windless area that I'm in.
You're in this role where you're working with individuals from different paths of life, totally different people. And you're in some ways tasked with not just giving them head knowledge, but in a sense, like helping them during a period of tremendous transition, almost like you're trying to form them, not just teach them. Is that how it feels for you?
So I think form is a really strong word.
Yeah.
Sometimes I point the way, but one of, I think, the most important things for not just the students that I interact with on a daily basis, but the other people that I coach or consult or that I meet in everyday life is to clearly define the end results that you would find desirable, to quantify it in detail that you could actually measure or evaluate. I think sometimes, and I'll go back to my college students for a minute, they are pre-programmed with the idea that coming to college means a certain set of expectations are met. And from the academic point, that expectation is an A, or it's always been a grade associated expectation. When what if you approached a class with identifying the gaps of knowledge that you have that you admit you don't know, and then at the end assess if those gaps have been filled in a meaningful way. One of the ways that I've been talking with my seniors, who it's this interesting cycle of kind of the first year, second year, third year. And then finally, when I see my seniors and they're ready to move out into the world, they're completely different people than I met 4 years ago. But related to what we were talking about, I like to mention to them the Pareto principle, which I'm sure you're familiar with because, I mean, first of all, that guy's name, Wilfredo Pareto, that's top 10 names ever. But Pareto, anyway, has this interesting principle about how a very small amount of control and power and production is actually what we see as part of the finished whole. So 80% of global wealth is held by 20% of the global population. This relates to humans because at the end of your 4-year college experience, every single professor that you met won't have been a home run. Every single mentor, advisor, friend, student, frat brother, everybody won't have been a home run. If you look at what is making up that whole, then 80% of what you experienced that was positive and good and moved you forward was probably delivered by about 20% of the people that you met through the experience. So over the course of 4 years, that for most students equates to about 10 professors that moved the needle, that made a difference. And so I had this interesting conversation with my seniors to see if they can pick out when those 10 professors appeared. Were they early in their experience? Were they midway? Were they abroad? Were they online? What common theme can they find with 10 people that moved the needle and then go out and replicate finding mentors and friends and coaches in the wider world that share the principles of those 10 people, not of, the 80% that you're trying to forget.
What I'm hearing you say is, in a sense, if you can recognize the patterns of those individuals that maybe had a potent impact on your life, and then intentionally maybe steward those sorts of relationships moving into the future. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. And it's difficult to see patterns if you're looking at all 100% of the people that are in your life, right? So you focus in on the 20% that are really moving the needle and making a difference, and then look for patterns, because it's easier when you have a smaller sample size, of course.
So is that just looking for the things that feel meaningful, the people that feel meaningful? Is that kind of the filter that you'd be running through for that?
I guess meaning is one metric that we could measure by. The person that maybe pushed you in a way that you hadn't been motivated to work harder before is another way that you can think of it. Or someone that approached a situation from a point of view that you hadn't considered before. And maybe at the end of the course, the conversation, the relationship, you didn't agree with the person, but they changed the way you thought about an idea, a relationship, a situation. So it's not always the 20% of people that make you feel great about yourself. That would be a really kind of boring sample size, wouldn't it? It's the 20% of people that moved the needle and maybe made you feel uncomfortable, but that's the place that true growth occurs anyway.
Now, in your work with students, are you consciously trying to pull those various levers you just listed? Or is it more of an organic thing where you essentially show up each day, try to have your heart in the right place and be smart about things? But yeah, how does that play out for you as you try to live out those sorts of qualities?
So I think, first of all, I am very conscious of the fact that I'm not in the 20% for a great number of students. Like the way that I approach class or the way that I expect really high standards, that's just not it for some people. And that's okay. That's a thing that I can release and focus on, those that did come to connect in a way that is exceptional or different or interesting. So I think more of the second way that you described. And it doesn't just have to be professor-student relationship. I think any relationship that you think about showing up to, whether it's colleagues in a work environment or even extended family relationships, I don't think you show up trying to manipulate or pull levers or bring a side of yourself that you think is going to change the dynamic or the conversation of the room. I think the best place is to show up open and listening, and then maybe have a chance to talk once you've had a good idea of what the room needs or what the person needs or what the relationship needs.
Yeah, it was fascinating because I had an opportunity to go out to Syracuse University at one point and witness you with the students, both in a classroom setting and as well as outside of a classroom. And you could tell that you just have a very strong rapport with a lot of the students, and that you, I think more than anything, seem to really care, right? That was the sense I got. And I think that's meaningful in and of itself, right? When you know someone really cares. Have you changed how you approach education since you've started? Are there particular things that you've learned that you've said, hey, that doesn't really work, I'm going to do this a different way? Is that something you built up to, your current approach? Or have a lot of those things just come natural for you?
That's an interesting question because the first time I stepped into a classroom, it was unexpected. I did not go to school thinking I was going to end up a teacher. My parents were both in education. My sister went into education. I was not going into education. I wanted everyone to be very clear on that fact. And then a series of circumstances emerged that led me to walk in and teach a college class very unexpectedly. And the moment I stood up and there were students and I had a slide deck and I was ready to go, I knew that's what I was made to do. And I think, first of all, what a gift. What a small percentage of people are allowed to walk into a space and know deep inside of them that that is what they were made to do. And so I think my approach has always been based on the fact that I've been given a gift to be in a time and space and to be able to use what I think are a set of talents to reach students in a way that is hopefully meaningful and hopefully conveys information in a way that's interesting and applicable and moves the needle for the people that are ready and open to have that experience.
It's interesting because when you describe your experience going into teaching and feeling like it was just so natural, right? It's almost like you're an Arctic seal that all of a sudden you're in Arctic water and you're like, oh, this is where I'm meant to be. It's funny because I've always been someone who's relatively passionate about the work I'm doing. Pretty much every job, well, not every job. I had a few jobs where I was working on golf courses and things, and I wasn't really that passionate about it. But a lot of my history of work, I've always been pretty engaged. And it was interesting because my wife, she always struggled a bit to find as much of a connection. And I remember having conversations with her around, what is it that you really want to do? Like, we'll support you. You want to go down this career path, that career path, whatever it is you want to do. Because I actually had a concern. I didn't want her to feel like she was following along my own life choices, right? Or that I was kind of driving the ship and she wasn't having the space to pursue the things she wanted to. And it was interesting because I think when we first got married, she probably would not have seen herself as staying home with the kids for a number of reasons. But then it was funny because when she started, after we had our first child and she stayed home, she described her experience almost identical to what you're describing, where she was like, I just feel like this is my purpose. Like, I love this so much. I feel so at home in this. And it's funny because in both those scenarios, it's almost like not that you had to stumble into it, but it wasn't even the thing you were actively pursuing per se at the time. And then you find yourself in this place. And that's such a curious thing. Part of what you're doing, I imagine, with students who you're teaching entrepreneurship, yes, there's all the business lessons, but in some ways you're trying to get them to follow their own sense of purpose, as it were. Do you have any advice or even like a methodology of like how people can kind of ascertain the right direction in that way, or find maybe that place where it feels like such a good fit for them to connect what they're doing with who they are?
Yeah. So one of the classes I teach, the one that you sat in with, was imagination, creative problem solving, and entrepreneurship. And the focus of that class has evolved to be exactly what you're talking about. So many students, and I think so many adults, are caught in this trap of saying, what is the job that I will do that I am good at? And back to my group of seniors that's heading out into their first jobs, into the roles that they are both equal parts anxious and excited about, that's kind of not the point. The point is that you are ready for the next 6 jobs that you're going to have after that first entry level job. So I think training for, or even thinking toward, this is the job that will make me happy, or this is what I want to do, is a dangerous trap. So one way that we can start to undo it is that famous quote, pay attention to what you pay attention to. And the tired ideas of idea logs, or writing down the things that you notice, they actually are used for decades and decades because they're useful. So one of the first things that I recommend doing is just writing down all of the things that catch your attention and start to narrow it into themes, or organize them into ideas or topics that you start to see a pattern emerge. So for me, I love coffee. Now, I'm never going to own a coffee shop. It's not something that I want to do, but I love coffee. I love the experience. I love the passion behind different roasters that have like a unique approach that make one bean taste completely different because of the way that they've roasted it and cared for it and sourced it. And so one thing that I idea log is all of the different coffee shops that I go to. And I look for the themes of what makes them comfortable and what makes them approachable, what makes it a good experience for me. And then it stops being about the coffee shop, and I start to understand the places that make me feel welcome and the places that make me feel like I'm in an environment that I could thrive in. And once those big pieces emerge, then that's something I can recreate for, in my case, my students. How can I make the environment elements that make me cozy and comfortable and ready to learn, to step into what's next? How can I recreate that in a classroom so that students feel cozy and comfortable and ready for what's next? So tip number 1, pay attention to what you pay attention to. And then the next part is when we talk about entrepreneurship, and even when people have ideas of what an entrepreneur is like, I like to redirect back to the idea that every human being has the birthright of cultivating an entrepreneurial mindset, and has nothing to do with starting a business and everything to do with approaching problems from a creative point of view, from taking a minute and reframing the issue instead of looking at what you think the problem is, stepping around the backside and looking at what the problem might be revealing of something else it's connected to. So this entrepreneurial mindset, I think, is the place that if you grow and develop and invest, you're ready for many different occupations, but also many different life circumstances and opportunities.
I want to pick up on that concept of reframing the issue, only because I have seen, even just recently, certain instances where there's a problem I'm trying to solve, and it's almost like you're trying to open a door that's locked and not realizing that there's another door right next to it, or a hallway, right? Like you don't even have to open that door. At the same time, just reflecting back on some of these experiences, I notice it can be really difficult for me sometimes to really step outside of my frame, because I can get a little bit maybe tunnel vision. I have certain ways of like figuring things out, so I'm not as likely to challenge the premise sometimes when I'm actually in it. So how do you help individuals to reframe problems, or do you have any specific practices around that?
Absolutely. First of all, one way that you can clear some of the roadblocks that come with the big problem you have sitting in front of you, one way you can do is to challenge yourself to list the assumptions that you have about it. So, I mean, the first assumption is usually this is a yes or no answer, or this is a go or no go decision. And that assumption is 99% of the time wrong. It's usually not A or B, yes or no, go or no go. There's usually a myriad of opportunities that you're not seeing. So listing the assumptions individually is one of the ways that you can start to generate ways around the roadblock. And in case it hasn't been said out loud somewhere in this podcast before, let me at least say, your ideas are crap until you get to 21. The first 7 ideas that you have, the first 7 assumptions that you list in this scenario, they're preloaded. They've been hanging out in your brain and they were waiting for a different party. Like they don't even apply to what you're trying to solve because they were already in the forefront of what it was that you were thinking, either consciously or subconsciously. So the first 7 ideas don't count. 7 to 21, you're just getting started. You might have something in there that maybe you could work with, but your idea generation as an individual does not become interesting, valuable, or divergent until you've cleared 21 ideas, and then keep going. So for this first piece, this list your assumptions, like 21 assumptions, that's baby stuff. Like get that out of the way and then just keep churning and you'll find the real roadblocks somewhere after 21.
So when I think about the concept of brainstorming or reframing, I know, at least for me, but I think for a lot of others, sometimes when you're in the midst of it, you maybe are trying to solve a problem. Someone was like, hey, maybe it's worth reframing it or looking at it a different way. I think in many instances, we do have an inclination to know that that would be a helpful practice, but I still feel that sometimes there's a barrier to actually doing it, right? I'll notice even with coaching clients, there's like a tendency to want to keep doing things that maybe aren't working rather than slow down and actually say, hey, let's go map things out. Let's maybe think about if there's a whole different way of approaching that. What do you think is the reason for that? Is that fear? Is that laziness? Is it something else?
So it's interesting that you even use the word brainstorming, because I think that's what people think of when they think of idea generation, right? They're like, well, let me get to 21 ideas with brainstorming. This is one of my favorite lectures to set up. So permit me like just the 2 minutes for the backstory here. Sure. Brainstorming is pretty outdated. It was actually developed in 1940 by Alex Osborne, is credited with this initial term of brainstorming. And he based what we know as brainstorming on these 3 main assumptions. He said, first of all, that groups are more creative collectively than individuals. That was the first assumption of brainstorming. The second assumption of brainstorming is that if you criticize ideas as they're coming out, then you're going to tamper creativity. Okay. And then his third big assumption was that if you generate a lot of ideas and you don't worry so much about the quality, then eventually you're going to have highly creative ideas. Now, since 1940, every one of those assumptions has been proven wrong. And yet we're still frustrated with like, why doesn't brainstorming work? Well, it's because what brainstorming was founded on has been proven to be incorrect. So let's look at the opposite. Let's look at how, if those assumptions were false, then what is true? His first one was that groups are more collectively creative, can brainstorm more than individuals. Well, we know that's not true. An individual, given the right toolkit, given the right idea generation exercises can actually generate more creative ideas than a group. 2 asterisks after that I'll get back to, but like in general, don't be frustrated if you're the person that says, I do most of my thinking, idea generation without colleagues that know exactly what I'm talking about. That's all right. That's cool. That's actually the best place to be for idea generation. The second assumption that his creativity brainstorming process was built on was that criticizing ideas will inhibit creativity, when actually we need that critical thought. Because when you start to pick apart some of those ideas, you see the threads that will weave together the better idea. So criticism is helpful as long as you're collecting it from people that are the right coordinates for the idea. Talk about that in a second. And his last assumption was that if you generate a lot of ideas without concern for quality, you're eventually going to have an amazing idea, when we just know that's not true. So when I say get to 21 ideas, I mean like get the junk out before 21 and then start to refine for quality as you generate past 21. That was an unexpected lecture you didn't ask for on brainstorming. Let me tell you one secret to idea generation that can help most people, and that's leveraging your weak ties. So when we start to generate ideas, or when we start to approach this really wicked problem that we have individually, the tendency is to take a little piece of it or take a bite-sized conversation about it to people we hang out with. And maybe that's our spouse, maybe it's our colleagues that we see every day, maybe it's our closest friends. And that's the place that we think we are brainstorming or we're having ideas, when we talk back and forth with people that know enough about the idea that you don't have to explain it. And that's where most people go wrong. Those are strong ties. People you see every day, people that are invested in your life, people that know enough about the backstory of what you're trying to do. They're not the ones that are going to help you with idea generation. Idea generation is best when you can meet a friend for coffee that you haven't seen in a year. Or maybe that friend from high school that you just met at the reunion, or you just caught up with at the reunion and you promised you'd keep in touch but didn't. They're actually a really good resource to call up and see if they'll meet you for coffee, so that you can throw a few ideas at them and see what sticks. Those weak ties, first of all, don't have to live with you, so they're going to tell you what they really think. They're not trying to protect a relationship. They're not trying to protect your emotions, but they have a little bit of investment in you. You've known them. You built a relationship at some point in your life. So they still are invested enough to give you thoughtful feedback, but not so invested that they're going to filter because they have to live with the fallout.
One of the things that I know you're passionate about, and I know is at the core in many ways of a lot of what you're teaching, is this idea of creative problem solving, coming up with these different solutions, having agency, reframing, those sorts of concepts. I would imagine that of the individuals who are listening right now, probably 50%, if you were just ask them, hey, are you a creative person, would say, no, I'm not. How do you understand what creativity is? And do you think there are people who are born more creative versus less, or is that a bit of a misrepresentation of what's really going on there?
So there are not creative people that are born that come out like glowing with ideas, and all you have to do is caretake them until they can speak, and then they will be creative. It's just not how it works. Not how it works from my like ad hoc observation research, and not how it works from like academic research where we study people that have creative output. Everyone has a creative element that can be developed and harnessed and unleashed to be used in a way that makes sense for them individually. So when I hear people say, I'm not creative, or more often I hear people say, well, my job doesn't allow me to be creative. What I like to offer is this scale of creativity in which you're measuring your technical skills, which most people feel comfortable measuring because we're taught to measure technical skills, right? In college, you're taught to measure how well you know something based on a grade. And in your work life, you're workplace, you're taught to measure your output in some way, whether you're an accountant or whether you're looking for podcast followers, right? You're taught to measure the output. That's the technical skills. And if you're looking for the creativity there, you're not going to find it. The technical output is just measuring how you can perform. If you put creativity or a creative challenge against the technical output, then I can better diagnose why it is you're saying you're not creative. So imagine with me, you have one axis of how high the creative challenge is in your workplace, in your life, in your school, whatever, how high the creative challenge is, and then measure against how equipped you are, how technically skilled you are to meet that challenge. Where we see those 2 points intersect is where we can measure if, best case scenario, you're in the flow of creativity. And creative flow is when the creative challenge of what you're approaching is very high, but your technical skills are also very high to match it. Now, that doesn't look always like an entrepreneur. That could look like an accountant moving into an audit space that they've never approached before. Maybe they're auditing a Fortune 500 company for the first time, and they have to collect data from places that they've never had to pull from before. The creative challenge is high, but their technical skills have made them ready for this challenge. And so if their technical skills are high and their creative skills are high, that accountant is going to feel creative flow. And whether they know that it's creative is beside the point. What they're feeling, that flow, is when the creative challenge is high and the technical challenge is high. What I think most people feel when they describe being uncreative is a level of either apathy or boredom. And that is when your technical skills are mid-range, but your creative challenge is really low. And you know how to execute, and just doing the execution day after day after day, whether that's in your 9 to 5 or in the hours after, just executing day after day after day with no creative challenge ever rising. That's when people feel apathy, boredom, and uncreative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing I want to add, maybe building upon that I think might be helpful for some individuals, because I do know there are individuals who are in particular maybe situations within their job where they don't feel like maybe they have as much agency as they'd like, or aren't as challenged as much as they'd like. And one thing that's been helpful for me, and I've seen be helpful for a lot of others, is that we have the material of their job that we're facing and the challenge that's there, but there's other opportunities for challenge throughout the day, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's where kind of embracing general ideas around like character development or personal growth can make things really interesting, because regardless of whatever your job is or whatever the specific role is that you're a part of, you still have the opportunity to always grow. There's usually more material you have to work with than first meets the eye, but you also can lose sight of that if you do become more disengaged, or if you feel like it's just kind of like, hey, let's just burn out the clock. So I think that's something that can help individuals a bit who are in those sorts of scenarios.
I wonder who you picture as the listener, because I'm only interested for myself, but I think that is your frame of reference so that they can approach this in a meaningful way, or guide the conversation so it's meaningful to them. But describe to me who you think is listening to our voices however many weeks from now. What do they look like? What are they doing? Who's that person in your mind that you're recording for?
Yeah, I actually have a list of people. So I have specific people written down that I have in mind as I'm talking. Some of the people are people I've coached. Some of the people are people I know personally. Most of them are probably between the ages of 30 and maybe like 60, generally personally oriented towards growth and, I don't know, some interest in encountering new ideas and practices as a path for them to live into a deeper potential, right? Like that's I think one of the common threads.
Yeah, but what are they doing? Like, what are they wearing? Is their sweater blue? Do they have tea or coffee? And are they driving, or are they on a walk with you? Like, what are they like?
They are driving or walking or potentially at the gym.
Oh, at the gym. So interesting. Okay.
Yeah, at the gym. it's kind of like perfect gym stuff because it's not really something that pumps you up per se, but it does keep you interested and going. Yeah, so I think gym, walk, driving in the car, probably wearing a t-shirt or
yeah, let's talk about the
a
person
button
in the
down.
gym, because right now you're demonstrating reframing, right? So instead of just saying, I have a problem and it's not even a problem, but I'm trying to define who's on the other end of this. And you gave me all the right buzzwords. It was perfect. But then, like, what are they wearing? So this person at the gym surprises me the most because that's not my lived experience. I never listen to podcasts when I work out. So it has not occurred to me that there are other humans in the world that listen to podcasts while they work out. So who is this person? Are they lifting? Are they running? Are they swimming with like waterproof earbuds in? Who is this person?
I think AirPods, probably.
Okay.
And not swimming, probably not running, probably lifting or doing some sort of like those machines, maybe doing some more just body weight sort of stuff. Yeah, I could see that.
And they have the tank on, or do they have a t-shirt?
I think the t-shirt.
Sure. Okay. What does the t-shirt say? It's my last question, I promise.
You know what's funny? The first thing that came to mind was a Batman logo, but I immediately thought, no, that's not it. But that was the first thing that came to mind. I don't know. You know what's tough is I stopped wearing shirts. All my shirts are blank, so I don't actually. It's funny. I don't actually pay attention to what people wear on their shirts because I think I don't wear anything on mine. So I have like banner blindness. I just don't even see it. So that's hard for me to access.
It's so interesting, though, how you could describe the person that to you might be an ideal or at least an expected podcast listener. And the thing that stumped you was what's on their shirt. You knew everything else about them. You knew what they'd be lifting. You knew where they'd be. You knew even that they would have wireless AirPods in, but the shirt stumped you.
Why do you think that is? Do you have any sense of that, hearing my responses?
If you and I were working through this from an entrepreneurial point of view, I would encourage you to now ask the question to your focus group, to your weak ties of like, what's on the shirt? Because what's on the shirt is your perfect partner. That's the place that you want to collaborate to reach your listeners, right? So if he has, or she, I didn't even ask you if you saw a gender, or if you just kind of saw a person. If the person that's working out has a local business, I can't even think of what might be on this t-shirt, but if they have a local business, then that's the business that you want to go and leave some of your stickers at, right? Like your Potent Podcast stickers, because your target market is at that business. Or if it's the Batman logo, then you want to create a future episode where you talk about, the potency of superheroes and what it is about those superheroes that drive us and make us want to be some sort of super version of ourselves. So that's why I wanted to know what was on the t-shirt.
Yeah. Is that an exercise that you do or you teach in the classroom?
No, but maybe it is now.
Well, what's fascinating about it is if I can just zoom out and see what that actual process is, what it's doing, it's essentially taking that which is abstract and making it concrete, right? So it's taking abstracted, I have this concept of who this person is, and it makes it concrete, and then there's something that becomes stickier about it, or it becomes a filter through which you can process information differently. But is that what that practice is, essentially?
It is making your question concrete. So remember way back at the beginning of the podcast when we talked about reframing? So let's say that your whole question was, who's my ideal listener? Well, asking who's my ideal listener gets you a set of answers that actually don't move the needle. It doesn't help you. It doesn't make you more accessible to them or them more accessible to you. But once we reframe, once we ask questions that get to a more interesting question, once we ask what's on this person's t-shirt, then we have a different set of answers that come up. And as you talk with different people about what's on that person's t-shirt, their assumptions of what your podcast is about will reveal themselves by what's on that guy's shirt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you meet very creative people, would you say, and maybe that's a false premise, but I'll be interested to hear your response. If you meet very creative people, do you find that what separates them is their powers of observation? Are they more observant than other folk, or is it something else?
When I meet interesting people, they're usually curious. And once I understand where their curiosity is rooted, the most interesting people have curiosity that's rooted in creativity.
Can you explain that? So you're saying that their creativity causes them to be more curious?
Yes, and their curiosity is rooted in a place of boundless creativity. Sometimes you meet people that are curious because they want to further their agenda by asking questions that draw you in, or asking questions that in some way will benefit them. And you could fill in the list of ways that it would benefit them, right? So we do this socially all the time. We ask our pre-written list of cultural questions so that we can build relationships for whatever end serves us. In a networking way, we know what questions to ask. And even the ones that seem interesting on the surface are really usually asked in a business networking way so that we can establish a relationship that will benefit us at the end. That kind of question that's rooted in self-promotion or self-advancement maybe takes time to reveal, but when it does, it's never creative. But when you meet someone that is curious simply because they have an overflow of creative thought and idea, or they approach the world in a way that is less about themselves and more about others, that is a more interesting conversation.
Do you see generosity and creativity linked in some way?
So yes, from some of what I read and bring to my students about like the effects of both generosity and creativity on the way your brain processes everyday circumstances. So we can rewire parts of our brain by tapping into kindness, by tapping into generosity, by reframing, again, what is important and what we bring to the world. Generosity and creativity can be an interesting marriage. I think generosity is an outflow of the area of your life that you take time to develop for the betterment of others. And for some people, that looks like they develop a skill that they're really good at. It leads to an accumulation of wealth that they can then pour out on others. I mean, let's all look at Bill Gates, shall we? So when we see his accumulation of wealth and the commitment that he's made to various nonprofits that he's started or funded, that looks like generosity based on a certain skill set that was refined and then harvested over time. So it can look like that. It can look like intangibles too.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because we've been talking about reframing a number of times in the conversation, and it seems that generosity is its own form of like a meta reframe, right? Insofar as it's our own framing of ourselves, or at least a premise behind it is that our lives are in some ways a gift, and that we actually have the potential to create good, and that we can generate good, and that there can be this force for good that we create for others. And what's interesting, and I've never actually considered this until exactly right now, I'm scanning my brain right now, and when I think about the people who are really curious, I notice that they also tend to be relatively generous, and they also tend to be relatively creative. And then when I'm thinking about people who are truly creative, when I think of creativity, I think of creativity in one level is like creating something new, something novel. Okay, that's creative. I think of kind of almost like the higher form of creativity, or the thing that's at least more inspiring for me, is when it's some sort of creativity, if something's actually being created it's not only new, but it has some utility. It has something to offer, some value that it's bringing. And yeah, it's just interesting because I'm seeing this interconnection right now for the first time, that it seems that this generosity, curiosity, creativity forms almost like a triad that seems to show up together. Do you think that's correct?
You actually just recited the widely held academic definition of creativity. It is bringing something novel and useful to life, to production, to the world that hasn't been seen before, right? So novel means it's never been seen before. It's completely new. It's usually built on an idea that came before, right? So cell phones didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on telephones that were in the wall, telephones that were rotary. Then what comes before that? Telegrams, carrier pigeons. Like it evolved. But that novel piece of creativity never been seen before. And then the second piece of a creative product, idea, service is that it has to be useful. It has to be both novel and useful. If you then carry it forward to what you just said, when you find something novel and useful, don't you have a choice? You can hold on to it real tight and try to capitalize on it and try to seek out as much personal profit and gain from this new novel and useful idea, product, or service that you have. Or you can open up. You can be generous. You can say, here is something that I've noticed in the world that I now know is novel and useful, and I want to see how I can connect this to people instead of making it small and holding it tight in my hands for as long as I can.
It's so funny because when you were just sharing that, I think you were talking about a product or service, but where my mind went was I almost heard it like you were just describing us, like as in human beings, right? That in a sense, we're all actually novel. Like every human being is novel, and every human being has the possibility to be useful, not just useful. And maybe that does frame us within a more utilitarian viewpoint, but that there's just some inherent goodness or value that we can be bringing. And when I think about that, that becomes tremendously inspiring for me. So I want to bring things back to a few practical areas where individuals may be able to distill down some of these principles around creative problem solving, around being the entrepreneur of one's own life. If someone is facing a feeling of being stuck or a feeling of not really knowing which way to go, are there any go-to processes or practices that you would recommend for them?
Okay, so when you said that feeling of being stuck, I thought about the doldrums. Have you ever heard of the origins of the doldrums?
I have not, no.
You've heard it used in casual speech though, right? Like just I'm in the doldrums, right?
Yeah, but it's one of those things where I've heard that. I really have no idea what it means. It's one of I probably nod my head and I'm like, yeah, the doldrums, but I have no idea what doldrums are.
The doldrums in casual conversation, it's one way that people might describe being stuck, right? So I just feel like I'm in the doldrums. Like I just can't seem to move past this feeling, idea, process, problem. I'm in the doldrums with it, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, the doldrums is a nautical term, and it was used to describe an area of the ocean around the equator where ships often get stuck because it's calm, it's windless, they can't move. They're stuck, quite literally. And when the air gets that still and the wind doesn't blow, sailors could get stuck for weeks, just hoping something will change before like scurvy sets in, right? But in present day English, the doldrums is a period of inactivity, of stagnation, but it's usually an indication that burnout is coming. So when people say, boy, I feel stuck, boy, I'm down in the doldrums, that's your first cue, you yourself, to say, hey, burnout's around the corner. I need to do something to reverse. I need to do something that can move me out of this windless area that I'm in. And most people try to consume their way out of burnout. So they try to buy or invest or fix in a way that isn't ever going to solve the problem. So when you're stuck, when you're feeling that doldrums, when the wind is not blowing, it's most helpful to, you guessed it, reframe what it is that you're trying to achieve. So instead of saying, I'm really stuck, I need more balance. I'm really stuck, I need more of anything. What we find, what research finds, is that instead of trying to have a balanced life, you instead redefine what a satisfying life is for you. Or what would be satisfaction on the other side of the problem. Not winning the problem, not solving all the issues. What would be satisfying at the end? And satisfaction helps us instead to reframe what it is that we can control. And very often it's the technical skills. Remember that little chart of technical skills versus creative problems? When I feel stuck, sometimes it just means I need a new set of skills to move past it. So moving back to that nautical term of doldrums, I just need a sailor that is most experienced at capitalizing on the smallest bit of wind. I need to bring in a technical skill set that can help move me past this area of stagnation, this moment that I'm stuck. So satisfaction can be a lot of things. It can be increasing your self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the capacity you believe you have the capacity to achieve it, right? So sometimes it's just looking at what you've done in the past and understanding what moved you forward and then capitalizing on those technical skills you've used before. And then sometimes it looks like investing in yourself, which most people don't think of when they try to consume their way out of burnout or stagnation. Investing in yourself means a different set of technical skills. It looks like an online course in reframing the way you think about things, or the practice of things like the monk manual, right? So investing in the technical skills of daily writing down areas that you're excelling at that you're not realizing are actually contributing to moving you forward when you feel stuck.
So I want to wrap up here with a few rapid fire questions. If you go back in time 10 years ago, what advice would you give yourself?
I can't remember the person, but I do remember the quote, and it's, "One day you will see how hard it was and how brave you were." So I think 10 years ago, I was very much proving myself in academia. I was saying yes to far more than I had the capacity to deliver on, and I was feeling it deeply. So 10 years ago, I would encourage myself that one day I will see how hard it was and how brave I was.
What's something you're trying to cultivate more of right now?
Something I'm trying to cultivate more of right now is feeling. So I am a thinker. I am a logistical planner. I am an organizer. And what I find that comes at the detriment of is feeling. So preview for students enrolled in my course in fall 2024, it will be at least a week on feelings and the feeling wheel. And all the areas that I want to run and hide from, we are going to approach boldly.
Beautiful. If you could give one piece of advice for how people can live a more potent life, what would it be?
A more potent life. So I think the definition of potency that I think of immediately is that area that is distilled and is the truest essence of the larger being. So if it is distilled, if it is the area that is representative of who you are as a whole, first identify it and then refine it to the point where you can be proud of it and then go give it away.
Great answer. What's something you know for sure?
Something I know for sure is that it does not matter how long I've been gone. It does not matter the type of day I've had. It does not matter who I am as a person. My dog will be deliriously happy to see me every single time I walk in the door.
Another great answer. What is something you're still trying to figure out?
Something I'm still trying to figure out. I have teenagers. And I've always described my relationship with my children as, I think we're back to nautical terms, actually. When they were very little, it was like we were in a sailboat together. They were in the back and I was steering. And as they got bigger, we transitioned to rowboats. And we were rowboats side by side, and I was holding their hand tightly, but they were still captaining their own little rowboat. And now we are moving in to my oldest, who is done with high school and moving on. And now I'm trying to figure out how to open my hand and watch him sail away with all the skills, all the equipment that I've loaded into his rowboat, and to be able to be present, to witness it, but also to let go.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Professor Wimer. Really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you.